I'm so happy to introduce Gabrielle Bates tonight. In my estimation, and that of many others, Gabrielle is an exceptional poet. Not only does she impress with what she has to say, but even more so with how she says it. With a bold voice, with a vigorous imagination, with a devotion to language, as something not just to know and feel, but also to be nurtured, to be desired, to be craved for, to obsess over. Gabrielle's debut collection, Judas Goat, published by Tin House, was named a Best Book of 2023 by NPR and Electric Literature, and was also a finalist for the Washington State Book Award in Poetry. Originally from Alabama, Bates is currently based in the Pacific Northwest, where she works for Open Books, a poem emporium, co-hosts the podcast The Poets Salon, and serves occasionally as visiting faculty for the University of Washington Rome Center in the Tin House Writers Workshops. A new edition of Judas Goat is forthcoming in autumn 2025 from the 87 Press in the UK. Please welcome Gabrielle Bates.
Thank you, Orlando, and thank you all for coming to part 2 of the literary doubleheader tonight. I'm so happy I was able to catch the Kaveh Akbar event before this, or most of it. I'm gonna toss this. That's not part of my shtick, I promise. I just get hot when I get nervous. Kaveh said something I really loved about silence as a material of poetry. It's something I think about a lot, and something I was thinking about a lot in particular in working on this book in regards to the image and what we don't see and how to describe around a thing, and how what's not shown or said is often the most haunting aspect. And this is nothing if not a haunted book. This is my first time in Indiana, so thanks for having me. I love it. I had the most magical day going to the grotto and the art museum. So it's really special to be here, and it always feels special to me to be in a room with people reading and thinking about poems. I feel more and more poetry as this vital counterforce for so many things that depress me, and including just the ceaseless barrage of soulless and sexless text and image that assaults our eyes and minds and hearts all the time through various technologies. And so for me, it feels like the small and vital counterforce to that, and I don't take the privilege of being in a space like this lightly, slowing down together, attending to language differently. I'm going to read tonight from Judas Goat. I worked on this book for about a decade, spanned the decade of my 20s pretty much. And it's a book that's obsessed with violences of various kinds, particularly looking at violence as a threat and atmosphere, usually in the theater, very intimate interactions between people. There's certainly a gendered aspect to many of them. And we'll start at the beginning. The dog. He didn't want to tell me. He almost didn't. It was luck, much more than gut, that made me ask. A beer opened an hour earlier than usual, the desire for conversation. There was no sense in me that he was in some sort of aftermath. He said, when I asked, I had a bad day, or I had a weird day. I can't remember. I saw a dog, he said. I was on the train. A man with a dog on a leash. The man ran and made it, but the dog hesitated outside and the doors closed. No, not on his neck, on the leash, trapping it. The man was inside and the dog was outside on the platform. The button beside the door ringed in light, blinked. The man was shouting now, hitting the button, all else silent. The befuddlement of dog pulled along, the pace slow until it wasn't. The tunnel the train must pass through, leaving the station, is a perfectly calibrated, unforgiving fit. The dog had a color and a size I don't know, so it comes to me as legion, large, small, fur long or short, white or gray, but the man always looks the same. As I held him against me in our kitchen, the moment sharpened my eyes. How easily I can imagine a version of our lives in which he kept all his suffering secret from me. I saw the beer on the counter. I saw myself drink it. When we went to bed, I stared at the back of his head, split between compassion and fury. My nails gently scratching up his arm, up and down, up and down, the blade without which the guillotine is nothing. So there's a running preoccupation throughout the book with mothers and motherlessness, which does have an autobiographical impetus, though as with most things, how it comes across in the book is both highly accurate and completely different. I still, after all these years, struggle to relay with any concision or clarity the familial configurations of my childhood, and I think that's one reason poetry is such rich terrain for me. Poetry being where we can grapple with those things that we can't say any other way, or to grapple with the vexed and unsayable. So this poem is more in that vein of the book. Hi. Effigy. Oh yes, they built my mother crudely on the patch of flattened grass. They told me half my blood was hers. They told me they'd help me wring it out. Our matter matched. That mama screeched. I muttered, get it out in my sleep. They told me I did this. Gave me a knife and said, defend yourself. One night, all night, I saw her tongue electrified white, extended in a pummel of rain. And when I woke, the tongue was in my mouth. It was all useless, the bleeding. What the self forms around cannot be undone. In Alabama, I faced the doors of a church and I thought, how to live if this is who I am. A woman walked by then on the sidewalk. I almost didn't recognize her shape against the sun, but she waved and said my name. I carry her on my back now. So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a place called Homewood, just south of downtown Birmingham. Anyone else here from like the deep south by chance? No? Great. You have to take my word for it, which is what I like. This next poem is a kind of hometown portrait. Strawberries. A car's tires thunk over the rubbery black tripwire at the oil change, triggering a fat bell. And a group of girls in silver leotards are reflected, like spatters of sap in its windows, liquidine, firm, gleaming. It's a game day. They are the girls chosen to split in tempo to the brass band, heel of a front foot sliding over astroturf, top of a back foot grinding over lit green, cervix slapping the 50-yard line like a fried egg flipped down on a griddle to burn. Behind the bleachers, a boy takes off the shirt of another boy, paints a letter there in red paint, R, and then another boy, I, O, T. When the sun goes down over the ridge, all the painted boys will make patriots. For now, the sun rises, sanctioning the street. Jiffy Lube, pet store, the Sam's super sandwiches teens file into, practicing the joke of language. The morning is cool on the outside and hot in the restaurant. The war and the words, playful as a war can be, meaning each gut bleeds out like a slit pig's, filling the cracks in linoleum, spilling over, becoming smooth. The layers of red dry and build on one another, and for years the gap between ceiling and floor lessens. Backs hunch as the mind saws downward, revealing rings. In the parking lot, "Are you asleep?" says the boy who is not my boyfriend, running his fingers along the band of my underwear. Across the street from this, for years, an ancient tortoise roams the floor of the pet store, closing his army green beak around the red toenails of sandaled women, thinking them strawberries. I feel ashamed for all the moments I've been kind, knowing kindness is all it would take. So for some people, the muse is like a lover, like a beautiful person, and my muse is this really filthy, awful pet store in my hometown. He may have also had a second one in Tuscaloosa where you lived, and it recently closed after 50 years, so it's a staple of my life. Pour one out for Ed's Pet World. And when a version of that poem, no wait, I'm lying. When I got my first copy of the book and I was in Birmingham, I took it to the pet store and showed it to the tortoise, which was very impressed, as you can imagine. Okay, so I think the titles of poems are really important, but I find that when I am reading out loud, sometimes my mouth revolts against it and doesn't want to read it, so I'm going to try something new, which is to read 3 poems in a row and not read their titles in between. I'll pause. I know some people are kind of following along. It starts on page 31, and they're all all three in a row. So I'm going to read Time Lapse, Sabbath, and then The Mentor, but not reading the titles in between. See how that feels. A hummingbird is pulled like a bull toward the loudest reds, lands on the inmost branch to preen, where only I can see the arching back of her green torso. I think of the sentence the boy, man, said to me while I lowered myself to a frameless, twin-sized mattress. Your neck looks so breakable. In a time lapse, nothing happens smoothly. Red horns quake as they splinter from limbs on the bottle brush. It was never the same after that. Dancing, walking around the cemetery I liked to visit when the weather was good, buying groceries after sundown. And what did I say to him? Did I say, thank you? Round white mushrooms emerge in clusters overnight, soil scattered across their brows like Catholics bearing ash. It's taken me almost a decade to admit it. I miss. I've missed feeding all my thoughts through that revolving blade, so thin it could only be felt. I've missed that arrowing of the, I almost said soul, but it was the mind, mostly, wasn't it, that winnowed? I knew God listened, and I knew where to aim. All the time, every second, I lacked, but with aim. He carved faces into the dead parts of cedars. He wore a belt of chisels around his waist. To determine where they were dead, he took a leafless limb, followed it like thread back to its spool, down the corresponding strip of trunk. In the middle of those woods, where the ground sloped into a large bowl, mist often got trapped, parted at our calves. We walked together for a long time, and as we walked, he traced what I said back to my left breast, down to the tender hole where I was once attached to my mother, until I went silent. Then he braced my back against a tree. He took out a chisel and kneeled. You ask when I stopped shouting everything and started keeping language close to my mouth, as if I were reading to a match that had to last my life. Well, it was not that day. That was much later, after the trees had all been cleared and the earth leveled. When I stopped begging to be believed and started telling the truth, no man was there. So in this book, I was working through a lot of feelings and fears related to men. And there's kind of a hyper awareness of gendered violence and the potential for that violence in the book, but there's also a very real and genuine tenderness towards men in the book as well. So lest you think I'm one-noted, I'd like to end with two poems that are a little more tender. This poem is called Salmon. My father and I sit at a sushi bar in my new city, sampling 3 different kinds of salmon nigiri. He tells me about a great funeral speech he recently heard a son give for his father. The speech was structured around regrets everyone assumed the father didn't have, interspersed with hilarious stories involving boys crashing the family van and fishing mishaps. The ivory salmon is pale and impossibly soft. The sliver of steelhead, orange enough to pretend it's salmon. How else to say it? I am my father's only child, and he is my mother. We dip our chopsticks into a horseradish paste dyed green and called wasabi. I know his regrets. I could list them. But instead, at his funeral, I will talk, if I can talk, about nights like this. How good it felt just to be next to him, to be the closest thing he had. I'm gonna end with the final poem in the book, in part because I spent a lot of time putting the arc of this book together, and I think it ends on the note I'd like to end on, but also the last 2 weekends I've been at weddings, and this is like a wedding poem. Has anyone else been going to too many weddings lately? No? I don't wish it upon you. I mean, weddings can be great if you think the people getting married really love each other, and it's a beautiful thing, but it's also exhausting. Okay, I'll end with this one. Anniversary. A little boy's starched white collar, an insect traversing the curve. Dusky pearls strung on a wire in my hair, wound low in a bow at the cerebellum, the brain's wing-shaped center for balance. It's April. There's no balance here. Not in the arch twisted from an ice storm struck tree, the bluegrass grabbing my lace. Scent of smoked meats mingling with the sugar-sweet confections just burst on the apple's limbs. Hands, fingers, ring of rough steel he bought for $35, whose ends don't fuse but overlap like an overbite. The symbolism isn't lost on a woman like me. There is a beginning and an end, April, and one of us will go before the other. Bees as a species are already dying, but we have tons. There, today, we have a live bee for every lapel. A bride should have a veil, they said, and so I bought one, paid and left it, like the skin of a fetal lamb piled on the counter. It was too finely made and traditional to be mine. The sun dims and it's April again. I can see a fire station now from our bed. Sirens come and go all night. On his left hand, the steel is gentle as the shadows emergencies cast on our wall in a procession of soft, bright bursts. As we pulled away in the long black car, Our friend who would die the next year tried to hand us a lit sparkler through the window. What happens to our questions when we die? I wondered aloud on our wedding night about the origin of daylight saving time, and he told me, it's dawn, dark, April. He blinks and apple blossoms fall all over my face. What's the name for the way we wake to sirens and each roll inward on the frame? It wasn't us this time, I mean. We're still alive, sleeping in our bed, candles cool and unlit. Small menace makes sweet the body of April, and that's the meaning of bees. But the mind's shape is simpler. When I say he hammered the ring to make it fit, I mean the ring fits. Thank you. Thank you all so much again for being here. I know you're probably all so tired and there's so many other things you could do.
I think that it was a good time for people to ask you questions.
If you happen to have questions, we can also chat after.
And you will be reading more poems tomorrow in my class. I'm
Great.
sure. Yes.
There's plenty of poems left in the book. Unheard.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you for that incredible reading. You mentioned earlier the importance of titles. And so for the writers in the room, I wanted to know if you could elaborate on that importance and how you think through titles. Do the titles come first? Do they come after?
I think titles are important to the degree that anything about a poem I choose to believe is important. And there are so many different ways that I approach them through the book. I don't feel particularly gifted at titles. I know there are poets who have almost like a list of really like banger titles and then they'll write poems towards that. But I can't do that. I know, wild, right? I remember Morgan Parker said she did that once. For me, I usually try to think of if I was trying to remember a poem and I was like, what was that poem that had the salmon? It's like whatever the most indelible, crucial single word or two words are is often something I will consider when I'm trying to think of a title, because it does almost always happen after the poem is written. The kind of running lead-in title is very in vogue right now. I don't do that a lot, but there's at least one in here where the title serves as the opening line of the poem. I tend to go with like simpler, almost like a recall exercise. There's often another move I see really commonly in contemporary American poetry is to take like the penultimate image or detail and make that the title. So I try not to do that anymore just because it seems like such a move I see everywhere. But sometimes that's the right one, My poem Strawberries, it needed to be strawberries, so.
It's always good to go against fashion.
Well, at least to question it, because in some ways it's really meaningful and interesting to be a part of one's moment. We can't choose to not be to a large degree, but when people start making choices without really thinking about why, just because it seems like that's what a good poem does, or that's always something I want to question. I would encourage everyone to question, because what you think a poem should be to be quote unquote good can be so corrosive to the work that you really need to write, and you only have so many years to write what you need to write. So avoiding those sorts of detours can be good, I think.
Rita?
Thank you so much for coming. I really love this collection. And
Thank you.
something that I'm constantly thinking about when I read this is the way that objects and material work with
Who was the other poet? Do you remember? It's okay if you
It's
don't.
Matthew Orr.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, the body and the material, objects. I mean, my obsession almost always is depth, and so surfaces are interesting to me to the extent that they are conduits for something that feels much beyond that. Poetry is full of these paradoxes, right? Like, to get at the deep, ineffable thing, you have to like spend a lot of time looking maybe at the surface of an object, or to say the unsayable thing, you have to use language, and all of these foundational paradoxes. I'm so in love with the sensuous aspects of language, and that is a primary draw to me to poetry. And so thinking less about objects and more about just the tactility, the textures and visuals, and this book is dedicated to the image in large part for that reason. Yeah, to ask those big, you can call them spiritual questions. I don't know how to do that without rooting it in the concrete. And Sabbath starts with the mushrooms with the dirt on them. I couldn't have written that poem any other way. I don't think. There's also almost like a trick to it, I think, as writers, and of course there will always be so many counter arguments for this, but I think once you've activated your reader's senses, their body in some way, they can go with you, or they will go with you more into the more abstract terrains. So I think it's worth your time to play with that on the page, even if ultimately you're someone who's drawn almost exclusively to abstract language, which I won't say you can't write powerful poems that way. Is that dancing all around your question? Is that answering it at all?
And actually, maybe you want to ask another
Great.
question. Great.
I don't see any other hands, so.
Yeah, reading your biography about, or your bio about your work as a visual artist, I was curious about how you conceive of that when you write poetry that isn't visual. I mean, doesn't include visual artists.
Totally, and I get tripped up on what terminology to use all the time for that. So I feel really distant from my work as a visual artist. There was a time when playing with poetry comics was really important to me. It was this other related, adjacent, but very different kind of playground for me at a time when I was becoming, I would say, overly serious about text-based poetry, or maybe just putting too much pressure on myself in regards to it, and working in this other mode where I was drawing and playing with text. It really freed me up and allowed me to access an important side of my creativity that just purely text-based poetry wasn't giving me. And I'd grown up, I'd always drawn. That was sort of my first way of expressing myself. So it was also a kind of return to that childhood self. I think if anything, my work in visual art has reaffirmed my deeper devotion to the kind of language only, the kind of image only language can make. There's always going to be a collaborative aspect, even when viewing a painting, of course, with the viewer's own mind and self, but there's something distinctly magical to me about the collaboration between reader and writer when we are encountering what we might call an image on the page, and the imagination, activating the imagination, and again, those layers of resonances and depths. And it's a felt thing more than an explicit argument I could make about why I feel that way, but I feel it intensely, and it's something I think I'll be digging into and approaching in various ways as long as I'm writing. But yeah, if anything, doing more visual work just made me realize this isn't actually the kind of image I'm interested in. I think if I had tons and tons of money and a few other lifetimes, I would love to play more with film because I think that that's a more interesting, more visual, textual medium. But you have to be so collaborative to work on films, and I really like having the control of just being me and my computer, or me and my pen and paper. Thank you for that. Yeah, Johannes.
I had a really similar impression as Rena, and some very vivid images sticking out, but it's also films are covered with narrative markers. In Alabama,
Yeah.
when I did this, I did
Yeah.
this. Usually I feel like, partly with the spark of the poem partly comes from, in a typical way, the narrative would be the arrangement of the poem, and then images would fit into the narrative. Just like images are the arrangement, and then the narrative are strangely where we might expect the images.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I love that observation.
Narrative
Yeah.
or do you feel like that I'm misreading you really? The narrative is really the most important.
No, that feels like an incredibly astute observation because for me, story and narrative is very important, but it is absolutely subservient to the image almost always. And but I do want both. I think when I was in my MFA studying poetry, maybe it was just the particular department I was in, but it was real kind of anti-narrative in poetry in this way, and so I absorbed these ideas about like that's not a serious poem, but I love narrative in poems when it's done well, you know. And I come, you know, the deep South, like many places and many traditions, is a storytelling tradition, and I was interested in how the South could permeate the book in ways other than just those explicit markers of like in Alabama, as more of like an atmosphere and a kind of aesthetic, taking certain notions of the Southern Gothic as we might understand it and applying them to poems, but my way. And so I think having that element of storytelling in there is exciting to me and meaningful to me, but it's definitely under the image. And for me, that, you know, anything that just slightly interrupts the expectation we carry into a poem has potential to give us a living tension to play with, and so I enjoy that aspect too. Thank you for that question and observation.
We don't want to exhaust you tonight. So
Oh, do I seem
think
exhausted?
Three questions might be enough. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.